The girl clutched the foal in a blanket and hurled herself through a wall of fire. The roof caved in right behind her, a blast of heat slamming into the back of her neck and shoving her forward. She hit the grass face first, both arms still locked around the tiny creature wrapped in the cloth. And the last thing she heard before everything went dark was the mare crying out into the night. Not a desperate cry anymore. It was a mother calling for her child. She wasn't the owner of the estate. She was just a hired, stable hand with nothing to her name but empty hands and an unfinished dream. And that mare was the only living thing left behind by the most powerful man on the East Coast. 12 hours earlier, she had been brushing Midnight's coat, thinking tonight would be just another quiet night. If this story touched your heart, hit like and share it so more people can hear it. And subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next story. Earlier that same day, long before the first spark ignited, Beckett Crane was sitting in the study on the second floor of the estate. The room was so quiet that the wall clock could be heard edging forward 1 second at a time. In front of Beckett, one of his enforcers was kneeling on the wooden floor, both knees to the ground, sweat running down his temples. He had just been caught skimming money for 3 consecutive months. Not much, but enough for Beckett to know. Beckett always knew. Harris stood by the door, his arms folded across his chest, his face unreadable. He had been with Beckett for more than 10 years, and in all those 10 years, he had learned one thing. The softer Beckett spoke, the greater the consequences. The enforcer lifted his face, his voice trembling. "Mr. Crane, I know I was wrong, but my wife is sick, and my daughter needs tuition money. I didn't have any other choice." Beckett didn't shout. He didn't slam the desk. He didn't rise from his chair. He only looked at the man, his gaze flat and still as the surface of a frozen lake. Then he asked, in a voice so quiet that the man had to lean forward to hear it clearly, "Do you have a family?" The man nodded again and again, and a flicker of hope lit his eyes. He thought Beckett was about to spare him. He thought a question about family meant that his employer still had some trace of compassion left in him. Beckett gave a slight nod, as though weighing the matter. Then he said, still in that weightless voice, "Then you should go home to them tonight. Give them a decent dinner, because starting tomorrow, you won't have anything left to bring home to them." The enforcer opened his mouth, meaning to say more, but Beckett had already turned his face away. The conversation was over. In Beckett Crane's world, once he no longer looked at someone, that person no longer existed. Harris stepped forward, gripped the man by the arm, and led him outside. The door closed without a sound. Beckett remained seated for a few more seconds. No regret, no anger. He handled this the way a person cuts away a branch eaten through with rot. There was no personal feeling in it. It was simply something that had to be done. That was why the entire underworld of America's East Coast feared Beckett Crane. Not because he was brutal, but because he was ruthless in a way that was measured, deliberate, and exact. He didn't need his fists. He didn't need weapons. He could strip people of everything with only a few sentences softer than a whisper, and he did it without so much as shifting in his chair. Beckett rose, pulled his suit sleeve straight, and stepped out of the room. He walked the length of the second-floor hallway, descended the staircase, and went out through the back door of the estate. His steps carried him toward the stable at the far edge of the property. The afternoon was beginning to fade. The last sunlight of the day laid a wash of amber over the Crane estate. The estate was vast, set in the Virginia suburbs, enclosed by iron fencing and guarded by a security detail on watch 24 hours a day. On the outside, it was a thoroughbred horse farm owned by a wealthy businessman. On the inside, it was the operational center of an empire that appeared on no document anywhere. Beckett walked toward the stable, and in the span of roughly 20 steps from the estate's back door to the stable gate, something strange happened. His shoulders lowered. His jaw was no longer clenched tight. His pace slowed, as though every step toward the stable peeled away one layer of the invisible armor he wore all day long. Because inside that stable, there was a horse before which even Beckett Crane couldn't remain cold. Beckett pushed open the stable gate and stepped inside. Jolene was standing beside Midnight, a grooming brush in her hand, stroking it gently along the black mare's back. Midnight stood still, her eyes half closed, her belly round and full with a foal nearly due. Jolene heard the sound of footsteps, turned, lowered her head in greeting, then stepped back to one side. She didn't look Beckett directly in the eye. In 4 months of working at the Crane estate, Jolene had learned certain things without anyone ever needing to teach her. The people who came to see Beckett always bowed their heads lower than his. The guards around the estate always wore dark suits buttoned high, carrying themselves with a quiet menace, their eyes forever sweeping the grounds as though waiting for something to happen. From time to time, unfamiliar cars arrived in the night and left again before dawn. Jolene didn't ask questions. She didn't need to know who Beckett Crane was in the world beyond the estate gates. She only needed the job, the roof over her head, and the chance to stay close to horses. That was the silent agreement she had made with herself when she accepted work here. Beckett didn't look at Jolene. He went straight to Midnight and placed his right hand against the black mare's forehead. Midnight gave a soft little whinny and rubbed her head into his palm, and in that moment, something happened that Jolene had never grown used to, even after seeing it many times. Beckett's face changed, not by much. Only the rigid lines of his features softened a little, and the cold in his eyes warmed by the smallest degree. Only a little, but it was enough for Jolene to understand that the man standing before this black mare wasn't the same man the entire estate feared. He stroked a hand down the bridge of Midnight's nose, slowly, as though she were the only living creature in the world to whom he allowed himself tenderness. Jolene stepped back another pace and stood still, not wanting to break that moment apart. Beckett remained beside Midnight for a while, then turned to Jolene. His voice returned to its usual form, brief and spare, not a word wasted. "How is she?" Jolene answered with her eyes lowered. "Midnight is fine. The foal is developing well. It should be about 2 more weeks now. I've noticed she's been eating less these past few days, but that's normal at this stage. I watch over her every night." Beckett nodded and asked nothing more. He looked at Jolene for 1 extra second, as though measuring something in silence. Then he said, in the same flat tone, "This horse trusts you. She doesn't trust many people." After that, Beckett turned and walked out of the stable without waiting for Jolene to respond. Jolene stood there, watching his back disappear beyond the gate. She didn't understand how heavy that sentence truly was. In Beckett Crane's world, trust was the most extravagant thing of all, more costly than any thoroughbred in this stable. And when he said that Midnight trusted her, it wasn't praise. It was confirmation that Jolene had passed a test she hadn't even known she was taking. But Jolene was only the horse girl. She turned back, set the brush down, ran a gentle hand over Midnight's neck, and whispered, "It's all right now, baby. It's just you and me." Midnight gave a soft whinny and pressed her nose against Jolene's shoulder. Jolene smiled, a rare smile she reserved only for horses. Outside in the yard, Beckett stepped into the black car that had already been started for him. Harris sat in the front passenger seat, phone in hand, confirming a meeting with a business partner in a city about an hour's drive from the estate. Before the car pulled away, Beckett rolled down the window, called the head of security over, and said only one sentence. "Watch the stable. Midnight is close to foaling. If anything happens to that horse, I'll be asking you." The guard nodded, his face tightening at once. The car left the estate, its taillights gliding past the line of trees before vanishing into the dark. Night fell. The Crane estate sank into silence, and no one in the estate knew that tonight would become the longest night this place had ever endured. At around 2 o'clock in the morning, Jolene jolted awake from her bed in the staff quarters. She didn't need to hear clearly to know that something was wrong. Midnight's whinny was carrying across from the stable, but it wasn't the ordinary sound Jolene heard every day. It was the sound of pain, short, urgent, repeated again and again, as though the mare was trying to call someone to help her without knowing how to ask. Jolene shoved her feet into her shoes and ran outside, crossing the dark stretch of yard between the staff quarters and the stable. The night was cold, and a thin layer of dew lay over the grass, but she didn't notice it. She pushed open the stable gate, stepped inside, and saw Midnight. The black mare was lying on her side in the straw, her belly tightening in waves, the whites of her eyes showing. Sweat had soaked her glossy black coat, and each heavy breath came out in pale white streams into the cold air. Jolene dropped to her knees beside Midnight, placed a hand on the mare's neck, and felt the frantic hammering of her heartbeat. Midnight was in labor. 2 weeks earlier than expected, Jolene pulled out her phone and called the veterinarian. The phone rang 4 times before someone answered, the voice thick with sleep. Jolene quickly described Midnight's condition. The veterinarian said he would come at once, but even at his fastest, it would still take more than an hour. Jolene ended the call and looked down at Midnight. An hour. This mare didn't have an hour. She checked. Her hand slid behind the mare, feeling for the foal's position, and her heart dropped. The foal was backwards. Its hind legs were coming first instead of its front legs. If the foal wasn't turned into the correct position, both mother and baby would be in danger. And to turn a foal inside a mare's body, it took an experienced veterinarian. Or it took someone who had once learned enough to know exactly what had to be done. Jolene closed her eyes for 1 second. Her hand was shaking. She was only a girl who had dropped out partway through school, who had never held the veterinary degree she had dreamed of since she was 17 years old. Her father had died in an industrial accident while she was in her 3rd year. Her mother had fallen gravely ill and passed away 2 years later. Jolene had left school, left everything, and kept only one thing for herself, the knowledge in her head that no one could take away. And tonight, for the first time in many years, she needed it. Jolene opened her eyes, drew in a deep breath, and began. She reached back into the memory of lectures from her 3rd year, remembered the illustrations in the textbook, remembered her professor's voice explaining a breech delivery in a horse. Step by step, don't rush, don't panic. She spoke to Midnight in a quiet, steady voice. I know it hurts, but you have to trust me. Can you trust me? Midnight gave a soft whinny, her eyes on Jolene, then lay still. The mare trusted her, just as Beckett had said that afternoon. She didn't trust many people, but she trusted Jolene. Jolene turned the foal. Slowly, patiently, feeling every movement inside with her hands. Midnight let out low cries, her body shuddering. But she didn't fight. Sweat ran across Jolene's forehead and fell into the straw. She didn't know how many minutes passed. Maybe 10, maybe 30. Time no longer meant anything in that dark stable at night. There was only her hands, Midnight's body, and the foal struggling to come into the world. Then she felt it, the foal's 2 front legs sliding into the proper position. Jolene pulled gently, Midnight pushed, and in one slick, hot, trembling moment, the foal slipped free, black from head to tail, tiny, drenched, shivering on the straw. It let out a weak little cry, the first sound of a creature that had just stepped into the world. Midnight lifted her head, looked at her baby, then began licking away the membrane that clung to the foal's body. Each stroke of her tongue was slow, patient, the instinct of a mother horse that needed no teaching. Jolene sank down beside them, her back against the stall wall, both arms drained of strength. Tears slipped down her face and she didn't even bother to wipe them away. Not because she was sad, but because she couldn't remember the last time she had felt that she had done something that truly mattered. Maybe tonight was the first time in a very long while. She looked at the foal, and suddenly, a name rose into her mind. Coal. Black as coal, small and fragile, but alive. Like her. Jolene sat there watching Coal try to stand for the first time. 4 long, awkward legs, still unsteady under the weight of his own body. Trembling, buckling, tipping to one side. Jolene hurried to help, both hands holding the little foal's body, lifting him upright. Coal trembled, but tried again. His front legs steadied, his back legs wavered, and then at last he found his balance. Jolene guided Coal toward Midnight so he could nurse. Coal buried his head against his mother's belly and began to drink, his short little tail flicking. Midnight turned her head to look at him, and her eyes softened. Then Midnight did something Jolene hadn't expected. The black mare stretched her neck toward her and rubbed her nose against Jolene's hand, gently, slowly. In the 4 months Jolene had cared for Midnight, the mare had never once reached for her on her own. She had allowed Jolene to brush her, allowed her to examine her, but she had always kept a distance. The only person Midnight had ever actively sought out was Beckett. But tonight, after Jolene had just saved both her and her baby, Midnight pressed her nose into Jolene's hand. Jolene said nothing. She only laid her hand over Midnight's nose and held it there. She sat against the stall wall, keeping watch over Midnight and her foal. Coal had nursed his fill and lay curled close to his mother. Midnight had lowered herself down, her breathing growing steady at last. Jolene's eyes began to close. The long night of helping with the birth had drained every last bit of strength from her. She let her head fall against her knees and drifted into sleep right there in the stable, beside the mare and the foal she had brought into the world with her bare hands. Outside, the Crane estate lay in silence, too much silence. While Jolene drifted in and out of sleep beside Midnight and her foal, a shadow moved through the darkness beyond the fence of the Crane estate. Perry Stokes knew exactly what he was doing. He knew every blind corner of this land, every gap in the camera coverage, every shift schedule, and the number of guards on each rotation. He knew because he had once sat beside Beckett 6 years earlier, designing the entire security system for the estate from the ground up. Back then, Stokes had been Beckett's right hand, the only man besides Harris whom Beckett allowed to sit at the same table when important matters were discussed. The two of them had built an empire together, sharing the risks, sharing the profits. That was until 6 months ago. 6 months earlier, Beckett discovered that Stokes had been laundering money on his own through a channel the two of them had built together. The amount hadn't been large, but that wasn't the issue. The issue was that Stokes had done it behind Beckett's back. In Beckett Crane's world, disloyalty carried more weight than betrayal itself. Beckett summoned Stokes, told him that he knew everything, and then cut ties. No manhunt, no punishment, only a clean severance. Beckett spared Stokes because of the 6 years they had stood side by side. He thought that was enough. He was wrong. Stokes didn't see his life being spared as mercy. He saw it as humiliation. He had been removed from the empire he helped build, cut off from every source of income, erased as though he had never existed. Stokes lay awake through many nights, thinking about the years he had poured his sweat into Beckett's world, thinking about how he had been cast aside for a single mistake. Anger fermented into hatred, and hatred hardened into a plan. And he knew exactly where to strike. Not the money, not the land, not the people. The horse. Midnight. Stokes knew that Midnight was Beckett's only weakness, the one thing that could still draw softness out of that cold man. Burning the stable wasn't just destroying property. It was a blade driven straight into the one place where Beckett had no armor. Stokes slipped through the western stretch of fencing, where he knew the cameras were obscured by overgrown trees that no one had yet cleared. He moved low to the ground, fast and silent. The 2 guards posted near the stable were taken down, left unconscious on the grass without a sound. Stokes reached the stable and stood in the shadows, looking inside. He didn't know that Jolene was dozing beside Midnight deep within the stall. He didn't know that a foal had been born only a few hours earlier. He didn't need to know. All he needed was fire. Stokes set the stable ablaze. The flames caught the dry wood and spread quickly in the wind of the night. He remained there for a few seconds more, watching as the first tongues of fire licked up along the wooden walls. Then he took a silver Zippo lighter from his pocket, the front engraved with the initials P and S, and placed it on the grass beside the stable gate. Deliberately, he wanted Beckett to find it. He wanted Beckett to know who had done this. This wasn't an act meant to be hidden. It was a declaration of war. Stokes disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the night the same way he had come. Behind him, the fire grew, beginning to devour the stable from the outside inward. Wood cracked and snapped. Black smoke coiled upward into the night sky, and inside the stable, Jolene was still asleep. The smell of smoke woke Jolene. Not the familiar scent of dry straw inside a stable, but the smell of burning wood, thick and sharp enough to tear at her throat. She opened her eyes, and before she could even understand what was happening, she saw firelight dancing across the outer stall wall. Flames had already circled the stable, spreading from the outside in, feeding along the dry wooden planks of the walls, climbing toward the roof. Black smoke had begun pouring inside, gathering low beneath the ceiling before sinking lower and lower. Midnight let out a frantic whinny, sprang to her feet, the whites of her eyes flashing as she turned in terrified circles inside the stall. Cole cried out in panic, the thin, helpless cry of a creature only hours old, lying close against his mother's legs, his own legs too shaky to hold him up. Jolene got to her feet, coughing hard on the smoke. Her mind spun for a second or two, then survival instinct struck like a blade. She looked around and measured the situation fast. The main exit was at the front of the stable. The fire had already spread there, but it hadn't sealed it off completely yet. There was still a gap wide enough to get through if she moved quickly, but that gap was shrinking by the second. The fire had started outside, which meant the outer part of the stable was burning first, while the inner section where she stood hadn't yet been touched by flames, though the smoke was already thick. She had a few minutes, maybe less, before the entire stable would be swallowed. Jolene thought fast. There were 3 other horses in the outer section, closer to the exit. They were full-grown, strong, able to move on their own. Midnight and Cole were in the inner section, farther from the door. Midnight had just given birth, exhausted, her legs weak. Cole had only been born a few hours earlier and still couldn't walk steadily. If Jolene saved Midnight and Cole first, the 3 horses in the outer section would be trapped once the exit was fully blocked by fire, while she struggled with the mare and Foal. But if she ran out to save the 3 outer horses first, she would have to go back into the burning stable again to get Midnight and Cole. She looked at Midnight, then at Cole, then at the flames spreading wider. There was no good choice. Only the choice that was less terrible. She decided. Save the 3 outer horses first. They were near the door. They could run on their own. Open the gate for them, then go back for Midnight and her foal. It had to be fast. Jolene turned to Midnight, grabbed the lead rope tied to the wall, and spoke quickly, her voice shaking but clear. I'm coming back. Do you hear me? I'm coming back for you and Cole. Midnight let out a sharp whinny, her eyes fixed on Jolene. Jolene didn't know whether the mare understood, but she needed to say it aloud, needed to hear the promise herself, so she'd be bound to keep it. Jolene let go of Midnight, spun around, and ran toward the outer section of the stable. The smoke was thicker now. She had to keep low, one hand covering her nose and mouth, her eyes stinging so badly she could barely keep them open. The temperature rose fast, and she could feel the heat pressing against the skin of her face and her bare arms. Above her, wood cracked and snapped. The roof was beginning to groan under the weight of the fire. Jolene ran down the aisle between the rows of stalls. Ahead of her, the 3 horses in the outer section were in a blind panic, kicking at the walls, screaming, spinning in the cramped space. They smelled the smoke, saw the fire. Instinct told them to run, but there was nowhere to run. Jolene lunged forward, seized the latch on the outer gate, and yanked hard. The iron bar was scorching hot, burning the palm of her hand. She clenched her teeth and pulled again. The latch gave way, but the 3 horses didn't run out. They reared, slammed into one another, and wheeled in circles in blind terror. The fire and smoke had stripped away their sense of direction. Instinct told them to flee, but fear rooted them in place. Jolene screamed, her voice breaking against the roar of the flames. Go! Get out! Go! She threw up both arms and struck the stall wall to make a louder sound, trying to drive them toward the open gate. The first horse bolted through, the second followed. The third hesitated, spun once more, then finally lunged out after them. Jolene watched them vanish through the side opening and onto the grass outside. 3. Safe. Then she turned back toward the inner part of the stable, where Midnight and Cole were waiting. The fire had spread far more violently than it had when she left them less than 2 minutes earlier. The central aisle of the stable was now thick with smoke, and she could see no farther than a few steps ahead. The heat rose before her like an invisible wall, trying to force her back. But Jolene didn't retreat. She bent low, drew one last breath of air that was still almost clean near the ground, and plunged back inside, toward Midnight, toward Cole, toward the promise she had just made. Jolene plunged back into the central aisle and instantly realized everything had changed in the brief time it took her to drive the 3 horses outside. The fire no longer clung only to the walls. It had climbed to the ceiling, spreading along the wooden beams, dripping down in glowing fragments of red-hot charcoal. The corridor she had crossed less than 2 minutes earlier had become a tunnel of smoke. She could see no more than a few steps ahead. Jolene dropped low, almost crawling, one hand sliding along the wooden wall, the other covering her nose and mouth with her sleeve. She remembered a lesson from when she was young. Fire and smoke rise. The air closer to the ground is cleaner. She crawled forward, heading toward the intersection where Midnight and Cole were waiting. Above her, the roof groaned. Not the crackle of fire, but the sound of wood straining under heat, of joints beginning to give way, of the entire structure slowly surrendering to the flames. Jolene knew she didn't have much time. If the roof collapsed, this corridor would be buried, and she would be trapped in the middle of the stable, unable to get out, unable to get in. She crawled faster, her knees scraping across the hot brick floor, the skin of her palms beginning to blister from the heat radiating upward. A small wooden beam fell from above, burning, landing right in front of her and blocking the path. Jolene paused for a second, measuring. The beam wasn't large, but it was on fire. She looked to both sides. There was no way around it. She shrugged off her thin jacket, wrapped it around her hands, then grabbed the burning piece of wood and shoved it aside. The heat cut through the fabric. She clenched her teeth and pushed harder. The beam rolled away, clearing the path. Jolene left the charred jacket behind and kept moving forward. From the inner stalls, she heard Midnight's cry. Not the panicked scream from earlier. This was different, short, urgent, repeated, as though Midnight was calling for her, asking where she was. telling her to come back. And woven into Midnight's voice was Cole's weak cry. Those two sounds cut through the smoke and reached Jolene, pulling her forward stronger than any rope. She crawled past the bend where the stable split into two sections. The outer section behind her was now completely consumed by fire, the exit cut off. Jolene didn't look back. Looking wouldn't change anything. She had only one direction left, forward to Midnight and Cole, then find another way out. The heat rose until her hair began to dry and crisp, the skin of her face burning as if she stood too close to a massive furnace. Every breath hurt, the hot air scorching her throat and lungs. She coughed again and again, her eyes stinging so badly they were nearly closed, opening only enough to see the path. Her knees were scraped raw, her palms blistered, but she kept crawling, 1 meter at a time, toward the sound of midnight. Then she saw them. Through the thinner veil of smoke in the inner stall, Jolene saw Midnight standing, her legs trembling, her neck lowered to shield Cole beneath her. Cole lay pressed against the ground, tucked close to his mother's legs, crying weakly. Midnight had used her body to shield him from the smoke, pushing him into the deepest corner of the stall, where the flames hadn't yet reached. The instinct of a mother horse. No one had taught Midnight to do that, but she knew how to protect her young. Jolene rose to her feet, stepped forward, and placed her hand on Midnight's neck. The black mare looked at her, her eyes reddened by smoke, but no longer wild with panic. She looked at Jolene as though she were the only one who could help her now. Jolene spoke, her voice roughened by smoke. "I'm here. I'm getting you out." She looked down at Cole, pressed beneath his mother, trembling. She had to get both of them out, but looking at Midnight, exhausted after giving birth, her legs shaking, and Cole, only hours old and unable to stand steadily, Jolene knew this would be the hardest part, harder than anything she had ever faced. Above her, the roof let out a long, slow, terrible crack, like bone breaking. It was beginning to collapse. Jolene didn't have much time left. Jolene looked around the inner stall, searching for a way out. The main entrance ahead had been completely cut off by fire along the path she had just crawled through. But to the right of the intersection, there was a side door used to lead horses out to the training field. She remembered it. The flames hadn't reached that side yet because the wind was blowing in the opposite direction, pushing the fire back toward the main entrance. It was the only exit left. But between where she stood and that door, a large wooden beam had fallen from the ceiling, lying across the path, still smoldering. Jolene couldn't step over it, and Midnight certainly couldn't, not after just giving birth, her legs weak, her body still aching. Jolene scanned for something she could use to pry the beam aside. Her eyes landed on a manure shovel hanging on the stall wall a few steps away. She lunged for it, yanked it free, and rushed back to the beam. She drove the edge of the shovel beneath the wood and pushed with all her strength. The beam was heavier than she expected. She clenched her teeth, tightened both hands around the handle, braced one foot against the ground, and forced it harder. The beam shifted, rolled aside by 1/2 meter, just enough to open a narrow passage for a horse to pass. The skin on her palms, already blistered from pushing the burning wood in the corridor, split open, stinging sharply. She didn't look down at her hands. There was no time for pain. Jolene turned back to Midnight and took hold of the lead rope at the mare's neck. She pulled gently, urging Midnight forward. But Midnight didn't move. The black mare lowered her head, her muzzle brushing Cole where he lay pressed against her legs, then lifted her gaze to Jolene. The look in her eyes spoke more clearly than any language. She wouldn't go. She wouldn't leave her foal. Jolene pulled harder. Midnight dug in her hooves, resisting, her neck stretching back toward Cole as she let out a short, sharp cry. The instinct of a mother horse was stronger than anything, stronger than fire, stronger than smoke, stronger even than the fear of death. Midnight would not leave Cole. No matter how hard Jolene pulled, the mare fought her. Jolene stopped, breathing fast, coughing harshly. She looked at Midnight, at Cole, at the flames drawing closer every second. She calculated quickly. Cole had been born only hours ago, his legs still unsteady, his weight close to 50 kilograms. She couldn't carry him while leading Midnight. Midnight was exhausted from the difficult birth, her legs trembling, barely able to walk, let alone run. If she tried to move both at once, all 3 of them would be too slow, and none of them would make it out. But if she took Midnight out first, then came back for Cole, there was still a chance. Cole lay in the deepest corner of the stall, the place Midnight had instinctively pushed him to protect him. That corner hadn't yet been reached by the flames because it was farthest from the source of the fire. Jolene could make it back in time. She had to make it back in time. Jolene released the rope and stepped close to Midnight. She placed both hands on either side of the mare's head, holding her, pulling her face close. She pressed her forehead against Midnight's and closed her eyes, speaking softly, her voice steady and slow, exactly the calming technique she had learned in veterinary school. Not loud, not rushed. Horses could feel breath, heartbeat, calm, or panic from the person beside them. If Jolene panicked, Midnight would follow. She had to stay calm, even though inside she wasn't calm at all. "Listen to me," Jolene whispered, her voice raw against Midnight's muzzle. "I'm taking you out first. Then I'm coming back for your baby. I promise. Do you hear me? I promise." She repeated it, slow and even. Her breath moved warm and steady against the mare's nose. Second by second, she felt Midnight's body shift beneath her hands. The tension in the mare's neck loosened slightly, her breathing slowed a fraction. Midnight wasn't free of fear, but she trusted her. Just as she had trusted her during the difficult birth hours earlier, just as she had trusted her through the 4 months of care. Jolene slowly released Midnight's head, took hold of the rope again, and pulled gently. This time, Midnight stepped forward, slow, heavy, one step at a time, her legs trembling, but she moved. The mare turned her head once more to look at Cole, letting out a soft, aching cry that only a mother gives her young. Then she walked on, leaving him behind. Jolene led Midnight through the narrow opening she had forced clear, staying close to the right wall, heading toward the side door. The smoke was so thick she couldn't see anything behind her. She didn't know what was happening to Cole in the corner. She only knew she had to get Midnight out first, then come back. Every step Midnight took was labored, the mare stumbling, nearly collapsing more than once. Jolene braced her shoulder against Midnight's neck, half leading, half pushing, the two of them struggling forward through the smoke. At last, the side door came into view. Jolene shoved it open, and the night air rushed against her face, clean enough to make her want to cry. She led Midnight outside onto the grass. The moment the mare cleared the doorway, her legs buckled, and she collapsed onto the ground, breathing in ragged gasps. The estate staff had woken to the noise and the glow of fire. Several people ran toward them, one of them taking hold of Midnight's rope and leading the mare farther away from the burning stable. Jolene stood on the grass, breathing hard, coughing violently. She turned back toward the stable. Flames had already covered most of the roof, the firelight casting a fierce glow across the wide yard. Her eyes searched through the blaze, searching for the small black shape she had promised to return for. Cole. She couldn't see him. The foal was still inside, in the deepest corner of the burning stable. Alone, Jolene stood on the grass, her eyes fixed on the side door she had just used to lead Midnight out. She counted. Midnight was here. The 3 horses from the outer stalls were huddled together by the distant fence, but Cole wasn't here. She turned to Midnight, looked around the mare's legs where the exhausted mother lay gasping on the grass. Nothing. Cole hadn't come out behind her. The foal was still in there, in that dark, deep corner where Midnight had pushed him by pure instinct to protect him. When Jolene led Midnight out, the smoke had been so thick she couldn't see anything behind her. She had thought Cole would follow his mother. She had thought instinct would pull the little foal after her, but Cole had been born only hours earlier, his legs still too weak to carry him steadily. He couldn't follow anyone. He was still there, alone, inside the burning stable. Midnight understood before Jolene did. The black mare, lying on the grass, suddenly lifted her head, drew in the air through her nostrils, and turned toward the stable. Her eyes searched for the small black shape that should have been beside her. It wasn't there. Midnight tried to rise, all 4 legs trembling, collapsing again, then forcing herself up once more. She had just given birth. She was exhausted. Her body hadn't recovered, but still she tried. She got to her feet, swaying, then turned and lunged back toward the stable. The guard holding her lead rope was jerked forward so hard he nearly fell. Jolene rushed in, both hands grabbing the rope with the guard, pulling Midnight back. The mare fought with a force no one would have believed she still possessed after such a difficult birth. She dug in her hooves, dragged backward, stretched her neck toward the burning stable, and then she screamed. That cry was unlike any sound Jolene had heard in 4 months at the Crane estate. It wasn't a scream of panic. It wasn't a cry of pain. It was the cry of a mother calling for her child. Long, high, ripping open the night, carrying across the entire estate from the stable all the way to the main house. That cry held everything human language couldn't name: the terror of losing a child, the desperation of a body too broken to charge into fire, and yet still trying. A plea made without knowing who might hear it. The cry rose and broke, and rose again. Midnight jerked against the rope, her hooves clawing at the grass, tearing up strips of earth. The guard braced against the rope, Jolene braced from the other side, and only together could they keep the mare from bolting. More and more staff came running out across the grounds. Someone shouted for the fire department. Someone shouted for water. One of the guards ran toward Jolene, looked at the burning stable, and yelled, "The roof is about to come down. No one goes in. You hear me? No one goes in." The roof kept giving off a steady cracking sound. The center had already begun to sag, flames covering it from one end to the other. Anyone looking could see the stable wouldn't stand much longer. Going in now would be suicide. Jolene stood in the middle of the grass, still gripping Midnight's rope, her eyes on the stable. She heard all of it. People yelling not to go in, the roof groaning, the fire roaring, and Midnight calling for her baby again and again without stopping. The black mare strained against the rope in Jolene's hands, the whites of her eyes showing. Her muzzle pointed toward the stable door, where waves of fire rolled outward. She wanted to go in. She would die if she went in. But she still wanted to go in, because her baby was in there. Jolene looked at Midnight, looked into the eyes of a mother. And in those eyes she saw something she understood more clearly than anyone else standing on that lawn tonight. She knew what it felt like to lose a mother. She knew what it felt like to stand there and watch someone you loved slip away while you could do nothing. She didn't want Midnight to know that feeling. No horse should know that feeling. No living creature should. Jolene let go of the rope. The guard flinched, catching it in both hands, staring at her without understanding. Jolene stepped away from the growing crowd of estate staff and walked straight toward the stable. Someone shouted behind her. She didn't listen. Someone ran after her and reached for her arm to pull her back. She shook them off. She kept going, not running, not hurrying, her steps steady like someone who had already made the decision and couldn't be turned from it now. She stopped at the side door, where flames had begun to lick up the frame. She turned back and looked at Midnight one last time. The mare had stopped fighting the rope. She stood still, watching her, as though she understood what Jolene was about to do. Jolene spoke, her voice loud enough for Midnight to hear, soft enough that no one else could make it out clearly. "I'm bringing your baby out." Then she turned, lowered her head, and ran into the burning stable. Nearly an hour away from the Crane estate, Beckett was sitting behind the wheel, his eyes fixed straight ahead. The meeting with his business partner was over, quick and clean as always. Harris sat in the passenger seat, noting down a few points that needed to be followed up after the meeting. The car moved steadily along the empty night road, the space inside quiet. Then Harris's phone vibrated. Harris picked up, listened, and his face changed color. He didn't speak for a few seconds, only listened, then ended the call and turned to Beckett. "The stable is on fire. It's bad. Security just found it." Beckett didn't turn his head. He didn't frown. He didn't ask for the message to be repeated. His voice was flat, cold as the concrete road beneath the tires. "Call the fire department. I'm heading back now." He accelerated, but still kept the car under control. Harris called the fire department, gave the address, described the situation. Beckett drove with both hands on the wheel, his eyes unblinking. If anyone had looked at him in that moment, they would have thought he was calm. But Harris had known Beckett for more than 10 years. He noticed one small thing no outsider would have seen. Beckett's fingers were clenched around the steering wheel hard enough to turn white. A few minutes later, Harris's phone vibrated a second time. He answered, listened, and this time he closed his eyes for 1 second before turning toward Beckett. "Midnight is trapped inside. The fire has spread to her section of the stable. They haven't gotten her out." Beckett said nothing, not one word, but his foot pressed harder on the gas, and the car lunged forward. And for the first time that night, his face changed. Not by much. His jaw tightened. The tendons in his neck rose sharply, and in those cold eyes that never allowed emotion to show, there was something different now. Not fear. Beckett Crane didn't fear, but something deeper than fear, older than fear, living in the place he had buried and sealed away since the day his mother died. Midnight was the last thing his mother had left him, and she was trapped in the fire. Harris glanced at the speedometer. The needle had gone well past the point where he felt comfortable. He said nothing, because he knew anything he said now would be meaningless. Beckett wouldn't slow down. Not for traffic laws, not for danger, not for anything in this world. The car tore through the night, its headlights slicing open the darkness ahead. Then the phone vibrated a third time. Harris answered. This time he listened longer. His face shifted from tension into an expression that even he couldn't have named. He lowered the phone, turned to Beckett, and spoke more slowly now, weighing every word. The horse girl. She got Midnight out. Midnight is safe. Beckett drew in one short breath through his nose, so faint it was almost impossible to hear. But Harris wasn't finished. But the foal is still trapped inside, and she ran back into the stable to save it. The roof is about to come down. No one dares go in after her. Silence. Absolute silence inside the car. No engine noise, no wind. Nothing seemed able to enter that silence. Or maybe there was sound, but Beckett couldn't hear any of it anymore. Then the car surged violently forward. Beckett drove the accelerator all the way down. Harris was thrown back into his seat, one hand gripping the door so tightly his knuckles hurt. The speedometer climbed to a number Harris had never seen on this car. And Harris, the man who had followed Beckett through every dangerous deal, every longest night, every ruthless decision, looked across at his employer and saw something he had never seen in more than 10 years. Beckett Crane was afraid. Not afraid for Midnight. Midnight was safe. He was afraid for the horse girl who had run into a burning stable to save a foal she had no obligation to save. Harris said nothing. He held on to his seat and let Beckett drive. From outside, the people standing on the grass saw a figure burst out through the side door of the burning stable. No one had time to react. The girl was clutching something wrapped in a blanket. She came through the flaming doorway, made it 2 or 3 steps across the grass, then collapsed. Her knees hit the ground first, then the rest of her body pitched forward, her face striking the grass. Her arms stayed locked around the blanket, holding Cole until the moment her body hit the ground, and only then did her hands fall open. Cole rolled to one side beside her, still wrapped in the blanket, and let out one weak cry. Alive. The nearest guard reached her first. He turned Jolene onto her back and froze for a second when he saw her face. Jolene's skin had turned a deathly pale, not from the ash on the surface, but from a lack of oxygen deep within, the kind of gray that seemed to rise from somewhere inside the body itself. Her eyes were shut tight, her lips parted, her chest rising and falling so faintly that it was visible only if someone looked closely. She had inhaled too much smoke. Both of her hands were badly burned. The blistered skin split and cracked from her palms up across her wrists and forearms. One side of her hair had been singed short, much shorter than the other. The guard shouted for someone to bring the first aid kit, then dropped to his knees beside her and turned her head to one side so her airway wouldn't be blocked. More and more estate staff came running in. Someone brought water. Someone brought a clean blanket. Someone called for an ambulance. One person knelt beside Cole, opened the blanket wrapped around the foal, and checked him. Cole lay on the grass, all 4 legs folded beneath his belly, trembling, his black coat dusted with gray ash but not burned. The blanket Jolene had wrapped around him had shielded him through the wall of fire at the doorway. The girl had used her own body as a shield, her exposed hands gripping the blanket tight as they took the brunt of the flames in place of the foal. Farther away, Midnight stood where a guard still held her lead rope, about 20 steps from Jolene. The black mare had stopped fighting the rope the instant she saw Jolene come out of the stable. She stood still, her neck stretched high, her eyes fixed on the figure lying on the grass. Then she heard Cole cry. The voice of her baby. Midnight jerked the rope so hard that the guard let go, afraid the pull would tear the mare's mouth. Midnight began to move, her legs still trembling, unsteady, but every step carried her toward Jolene and Cole. No one dared stop her. The big black mare had just given birth, yet there was still a force in her that made people move aside without thinking. Midnight came to Jolene's side. She lowered her head, touched her muzzle to the face of the unconscious girl, and rubbed her gently. Slowly, tenderly, the mare's warm muzzle pressed against Jolene's cheek, against her forehead, then back to her cheek again. It was exactly the way Jolene had held Midnight's head inside the burning stable, pressing her own face against the horses and whispering words of comfort. Then, Jolene had done it to save Midnight. Now Midnight was doing it beside the girl who had saved both her and her baby. No one had taught the horse this. There had been no lecture, no technique, only the instinct of a living creature standing beside the one it trusted, the one who had carried her child out of the fire. Cole heard his mother's breathing nearby and began to crawl. His little legs scraped at the grass, weak but determined, inching him forward. The foal wedged himself between his mother and Jolene, curling up against Midnight's legs, his head resting on the arm of the unconscious girl. Midnight lowered her head to lick Cole's forehead, then nudged her muzzle into Jolene's hair again, as though in the mare's mind, this girl and her baby belonged in the same place. The three of them lay together on the grass, the black mother horse, exhausted but still standing, her head bent protectively over them. The newborn foal, tiny and curled up between his mother and the girl herself, lying unconscious, her face gray, her hands burned, her hair singed, but still breathing. Faintly, but still breathing. Around them, the estate staff stood and watched. No one spoke. The guard who had been shouting only moments before that no one was allowed inside now stood silent, his eyes lowered to the girl on the grass. The gardeners had come running out from the outbuildings and now stood at the edge of the crowd, not daring to come any closer. Someone lifted a hand and wiped at their eyes before turning away. Beckett Crane's guards, men chosen precisely because they weren't supposed to be soft-hearted, stood in silence watching the mother horse press her muzzle to the face of the horse girl. No one could find any words. There are moments when human language becomes unnecessary, and this was one of them. Behind them, the stable collapsed completely. The roof came crashing down with a thunderous sound that rolled across the entire estate, throwing a column of fire and sparks up into the night sky. If Jolene had been 10 seconds slower, she and Cole would have been buried beneath that wreckage. 10 seconds. The distance between life and death tonight had been only 10 seconds. Someone said quietly, "The fire department is coming." Someone else asked, "Has Mr. Crane been called?" The head guard nodded, his voice rough. "Harris already called. He's on his way back." Then silence settled over them again. They stood there watching Midnight remain beside Jolene, her head lowered, her muzzle resting lightly on the girl's shoulder, her breath falling across the face of the unconscious girl, as though she were standing watch over her sleep, as though she were saying, in the only way a horse knows how to say it, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. You lie there. I'm here." The black car tore through the gates of the Crane estate, so fast that gravel flew out in both directions. The headlights swept across the trees, and Beckett saw them immediately. The two guards at the gate were down on the ground, one slumped to the left of the entrance, the other face down to the right, both unconscious. Beckett hit the brakes, and the car stopped in the middle of the drive. He looked at the two guards, looked at the gate standing wide open, and in his mind every piece fell into place in less than a second. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't an electrical fault. This was a deliberate attack. Someone had entered his estate, taken down his men, and set his property on fire. Beckett stepped out of the car, every sense in his body shifting into the heightened state of alert he had trained for over more than 10 years in the underworld, where any darkness could conceal a threat. Harris stepped out from the passenger side and moved close behind him, his eyes scanning the grounds. But Beckett didn't stop at the gate. He moved quickly past the unconscious guards and went straight into the estate. Ahead, the glow of fire stained the sky red behind the main house. He rounded the corner of the estate, came out into the back grounds, and saw the stable. Or rather, he saw what had once been the stable. A heap of burned timber was still on fire, the roof completely collapsed, only a few bare posts left standing in the middle of the blackened wreckage, with weak tongues of flame licking at the last fragments of wood. Black smoke coiled upward into the night. The fire trucks hadn't arrived yet. The stable his mother had built, the place where Midnight had lived for years, was now nothing but ash. Beckett stood still for 1 second. Then his eyes swept across the grass, searching. He saw the 3 horses clustered together by the far fence. Then he saw Midnight. The black mare stood in the middle of the lawn, her legs trembling, her head lowered. And beneath Midnight, on the grass, he saw 2 things. A small black shape curled inside a blanket, and a person lying on her back, motionless, with several members of the staff kneeling around her, trying to give aid. Beckett ran. Not walked fast, not hurried. Ran. Beckett Crane ran across the grass, and Harris ran after him, and neither man said a word. Beckett reached Jolene in seconds. The staff member trying to help her looked up, saw the boss, and quickly moved aside. Beckett dropped to his knees beside Jolene. He looked at her. Her face was gray. Not gray from ash on the surface, but gray from within. That color that belongs to a body starved of oxygen. Her eyes were shut tight, her lips parted, her chest rising and falling so faintly it was almost impossible to see. Both her hands were badly burned, blistered skin running from her fingers up to her forearms. One side of her hair had been burned short, singed almost to the scalp. She lay there on the grass, in the middle of the night, beside the mother horse and the foal she had just risked her life to carry out of the fire. Beckett turned his eyes to Midnight. The black mare stood right there, her head lowered, her muzzle resting on Jolene's shoulder, her eyes on him. Alive. Midnight was alive. Then Beckett looked down at the small shape curled in the blanket beside Jolene. Cole, the tiny black foal, was trembling but breathing. Alive. Both of them were alive, and the girl lying unconscious on the grass was the one who had done it. Beckett looked back at Jolene. He understood. He didn't need anyone to explain. He didn't need the story told from the beginning. He looked at her burned hands, at her singed hair, at the ash covering her face, and he understood everything. This girl had run into the burning stable. Not once. More than once. She had pulled Midnight out. Then she had gone back for Cole. She had carried the foal through the flames. And she had done all of it not because she was afraid of Beckett Crane. She wasn't afraid of him. She hadn't even thought of him while the fire burned. She had done it for Midnight. For Cole. For the horse she brushed every day and the foal she had delivered with her bare hands only hours earlier. For that reason alone. No calculation. No bargain. No reason except that she couldn't leave them behind. Beckett's hands were shaking. He looked down at them and saw the tremor in them, and he couldn't stop it. These were the hands that had signed the orders ending more careers than he cared to count. The hands that had held a steering wheel steady through every chase. Hands that had never trembled in front of anyone, under any circumstances. And now they were shaking beside an unconscious horse girl lying on the grass. Beckett pulled out his phone and made the call. His voice was short, sharp, allowing no refusal. Medical helicopter, Crane Estate, right now. He ended the call. No explanation, no request, an order, because that was the only way Beckett Crane knew how to deal with anything. But after the call ended, he didn't stand up. He stayed on his knees there beside Jolene, watching the weak rise and fall of her chest. He counted. Every breath. 1, 2, 3. Each breath was proof that she was still alive. Each space between one breath and the next was the longest stretch of time he had ever known. Harris stood a few steps behind him. He looked at his employer kneeling on the grass beside a girl whom only 12 hours earlier Beckett had referred to as the horse girl, in that same flat voice stripped of feeling. Harris had followed Beckett for more than 10 years. He had seen Beckett face the most dangerous enemies without so much as shifting in place. He had seen him make the cruelest decisions without the slightest change of expression, but he had never, not once, seen Beckett Crane kneel before anyone, until tonight. Harris turned his face away and looked elsewhere. There are some things that even the most loyal right hand knows he shouldn't watch for too long, so he stood guard there with his back to Beckett, his eyes on the darkness, giving his employer a few minutes without witnesses. A few minutes in which Beckett Crane didn't have to be the boss. Only a man kneeling beside the girl who had just saved the most precious thing in his life, counting every one of her breaths and praying that the next one would come. The medical helicopter reached the Crane Estate less than 20 minutes after Beckett's call. The medical team jumped out, laid Jolene on a stretcher, fitted an oxygen mask over her face, and started an intravenous line in the arm that hadn't been burned. Beckett stood there watching them carry Jolene up into the helicopter, the rotors whipping the grass and ash into the air in violent gusts. The aircraft lifted off, its red light blinking smaller and smaller across the night sky until it disappeared. Beckett remained there for a few seconds more, watching that light until he could no longer see it. Then he turned back. The fire trucks had arrived, too late. The stable had long since collapsed. Firefighters were spraying water over the smoldering wreckage, extinguishing the last pockets of flame. The estate staff had moved Midnight and Cole into the auxiliary stalls behind the main house, a temporary shelter where they would be safe. The 3 outer horses had been led back near the fence, with people posted there to watch them. Everything was being handled, but Beckett didn't care about handling things. He walked toward the ashes. Harris followed him without asking what he was doing. He knew Beckett wasn't the kind of man who sat and waited for answers. He went out and found them himself. Beckett stepped into the remains of the collapsed stable. The ash was still hot, and he could feel the heat through the soles of his shoes. He bent down and used his bare hands to sweep aside layer after layer of ash, turning over pieces of burned wood, searching. The hands that had been shaking beside Jolene 20 minutes earlier were steady again now, precise, purposeful. Beckett Crane had returned. He was no longer the man kneeling on the grass counting breaths. Now he was the boss on the hunt. He found it near the stable gate. A silver Zippo lighter, blackened with soot but still intact. Beckett picked it up and rubbed it clean with his thumb. The two engraved initials emerged beneath the soot. P. S. Perry Stokes. Beckett looked at those two letters, and his face turned to ice. Not anger. Anger is hot, something that flares and then burns out. What showed on Beckett's face now was colder than that. It was certainty. He knew who had done this, and he knew why the lighter had been left here, right beside the gate, the easiest place to find it. Stokes hadn't dropped it. Stokes had left it behind, deliberately. He wanted Beckett to know. This was a declaration of war. Beckett rose to his feet, the Zippo in his hand, and turned to Harris. His voice was flat, each word falling like stone. He knows the security system because he helped me build it. He knows the shifts. He knows the camera blind spots. He knows everything, because I trusted him enough to let him know everything. Beckett looked down at the lighter in his hand. I spared him once. 6 months ago, when I found out he was laundering money behind my back, I cut him out but let him live. I thought 6 years at my side was worth one act of mercy. He paused. That was a mistake. Harris said nothing. He didn't need to ask what his employer intended to do next. The answer was already there in Beckett's eyes, cold and certain as steel. That same night, while the ashes of the stable still glowed and Jolene was still lying on an emergency treatment table at a hospital many kilometers away, Beckett Crane went to see Perry Stokes. He didn't bring an army with him. He didn't need one. It was only Beckett and Harris, going to the place where Stokes was staying, walking in as though they were entering their own house. Stokes was sitting in the room when Beckett entered, and he smiled. It was the smirk of a man who believed he had won. "So all your horses are dead?" he said, leaning back in his chair, challenge written all over his face. "Does it hurt, Crane?" Beckett didn't answer. He pulled out the chair opposite Stokes and sat down, slowly. Then he set the silver Zippo on the table between them. The sound of metal touching wood was soft, but sharp in the quiet room. Beckett looked at Stokes and said nothing. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. Stokes was still smiling, but the smile began to harden at the corners of his mouth. 40 seconds. Stokes looked at the Zippo, then back at Beckett, and realized that Beckett wasn't angry. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't threatening him. He was only sitting there, looking at him. And that was when Stokes began to feel fear, because he had known Beckett Crane long enough to understand this much. When Beckett shouted, he was still safe. When Beckett was silent, everything had already been decided. Then Beckett spoke. His voice was quiet, level, unchanged. "The horses all lived." Stokes blinked. The smile vanished. "The horse girl saved every one of them. She ran into the burning stable 3 times. The last time, she carried the foal through the fire in her arms. The roof came down right behind her." Beckett paused. "She almost died because of you." Another stretch of silence. Then Beckett said, in that same weightless voice, "I won't spare you a second time." Beckett stood up, pushed the chair back into place, turned, and walked out of the room. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The door closed behind him, and that was the last time anyone in the East Coast underworld ever saw Perry Stokes again. He vanished. No one knew where he went. No one asked. And no one dared ask. In Beckett Crane's world, there are questions wise people know better than to speak aloud. Jolene was lying in the finest private hospital in the Virginia region, in a room of her own on an upper floor, with a window looking out over a line of trees. She didn't know how she had gotten there. She didn't know who had paid for a room like this. She didn't know why there was always a man in a suit sitting outside her door around the clock. She only knew that when she opened her eyes for the first time after the night of the fire, both her hands were wrapped in white bandages from her fingers to her elbows. Her throat burned from the smoke she had inhaled, and one side of her hair had been cut close because it had been singed. The nurse told her she had been unconscious for almost 2 days. She asked about midnight and Cole. The nurse didn't know. She asked again. No one could answer her. She lay back, staring at the ceiling, and that old familiar helplessness came back to her. the same helplessness she had thought she had left behind in the stable along with the fire. What Jolene didn't know was that every night, after the nurses changed shifts and the hospital hallway had gone quiet, Beckett Crane came into her room. He came while she was asleep, sat down in the chair in the corner, and stayed there. He did nothing. He didn't look at his phone. He didn't handle business. He only sat in the darkness, watching the girl lying in the hospital bed with both arms wrapped in bandages, listening to the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. He stayed there until dawn was close, then stood and left before she woke. For 2 nights in a row, Beckett came and went that way, and Jolene never knew. During those 2 nights, Beckett didn't only sit there. He told Harris to find out about Jolene Marsh, not the kind of investigation he usually ordered on enemies or subordinates. He meant for Harris to learn about her. Harris brought him back a thin file, because there wasn't much in Jolene's life to turn into a dossier. Born in a small town, father worked construction, died in a job site accident when she was in her 2nd year of veterinary school. Her mother fell gravely ill, and Jolene left school to care for her, taking whatever work she could find to pay medical debt. Her mother died 2 years later. Jolene was 24, with no family, no degree, no home. She drifted through one hard labor job after another until she was hired to care for horses at the Crane estate 4 months earlier. That was all. A whole life that fit on barely 1 page. Beckett finished reading it, set the file down, and said nothing. Then he picked up his phone and made a call, not to Harris, not to a business partner. He called the university Jolene had once attended and spoke to someone in admissions. The call lasted less than 5 minutes. Beckett Crane didn't ask. He didn't plead. He arranged. And when Beckett Crane arranged something, it was arranged. On the 3rd night, Beckett entered the hospital room as he had the 2 nights before. Quiet step, chair drawn back in the corner, sitting in the dark. But tonight Jolene wasn't asleep. She had been awake before he came in. She heard the door open, the light footfalls, the scrape of the chair. She lay still, her eyes barely open, looking at the figure seated in the corner of the room, and she recognized who it was. Jolene remained still a little longer, watching Beckett in the dark. He sat with his back straight, both hands resting on his thighs, his eyes turned toward her, without moving, like a statue, or like a guard standing watch. At last Jolene spoke, her voice hoarse because her throat still hurt. "How long have you been sitting there?" Beckett didn't startle. Maybe he had known she was awake. Maybe not. He didn't answer that question. "Midnight is all right," he said. "Cole is all right. They're both in the auxiliary stable. They're being cared for." Jolene closed her eyes and drew in a deep breath. All right. They were all right. That was the only thing she had needed to hear since waking. She opened her eyes and looked at Beckett. "Why are you here?" Silence. It stretched between them. In the room there was only the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Beckett looked toward the window, at the trees outside the hospital, then back at Jolene, and for the first time, he spoke of something he had never spoken of to anyone but himself. "My mother raised Midnight from the day she was born," Beckett said, his voice low and slow, nothing like the voice of Command Harris and the guards were used to hearing. "She was sick for the last few years. Before she died, she asked me to keep Midnight safe. She said that horse was the only thing she was leaving behind that was still clean." He paused. The silence that followed lasted for several heartbeats on the monitor. "I kept my word, but I couldn't care for her the way my mother did. I'm not built for that. Then you came." He looked at Jolene. "You nearly died saving her Foal. I owe you something I don't know how to repay." Beckett stood, crossed to the table beside the hospital bed, and placed a small box wrapped in black cloth on it. Then he remained there, not sitting down again, not walking out, only standing beside the bed and looking at Jolene. "Open it," he said. Jolene looked at the box, then at Beckett. Using the hand that was less badly burned, she awkwardly lifted the lid with her bandaged fingers. Inside, resting on the black cloth, was a silver bracelet. On its face was the engraving of a small horse, and beneath it the Crane family mark, the symbol she had seen on the estate gates, on Beckett's car, on everything that belonged to his empire. "From now on, you belong to the House of Crane," Beckett said, his voice returning to that flat, emotionless stillness, as though he had closed again the door he had opened for a few brief seconds. "No one is allowed to touch you." Jolene looked at the bracelet, looked at the horse engraved into the silver. Then she looked up at Beckett. She didn't cry. She didn't thank him. She didn't say anything grand. She only looked at him, and in her eyes there was something Beckett wasn't used to receiving: understanding. She understood that the man standing in front of her didn't know how to say thank you. He didn't know how to show that someone mattered. He only knew how to protect, and this bracelet, this sentence, was everything he knew how to give. In Beckett Crane's world, the words "no one is allowed to touch you" carried more weight than any thank you, more weight than money, more weight than a promise, because they meant that his entire underworld empire, all the power, all the fear he had spent more than 10 years building, would now stand behind the 24-year-old horse girl who had nothing to her name except burned hands and an unfinished dream. Jolene gave a small nod. Just one nod, and that was enough. Beckett turned, walked out of the room, and the door closed softly behind him, without a sound. Jolene lay there, looking at the silver bracelet in her hand, her bandaged fingers lightly touching the engraved horse on the silver. Outside the window, dawn was almost here. 3 months later, the new stable stood in the exact place where the old one had once been, but everything about it was different. Stronger, larger, built from brick and steel instead of wood. It held the most advanced fire protection system money could buy: automatic sprinklers, smoke sensors, alarms connected directly to the fire station. Harris had once joked that the new stable was safer than Beckett's office. Beckett hadn't joked back. He had only said, "That's right." Jolene returned to work at the Crane estate when the doctors allowed it. Her hands had healed, but burn scars stretched from her wrists to her elbows, pale pink and ridged, never to be what they had been before. Her hair had grown back on the side that had burned, but shorter than the other, so she cut it all to match. She didn't hide the scars. She didn't wear long sleeves. She didn't wrap them in bandages. She let them show every time she held a brush, every time she gripped a lead rope, every time she laid her hand against a horse's neck. They weren't marks of an accident. They were proof that she had done what was right. Cole was 3 months old now, no longer the tiny, trembling creature on the straw that night. The black foal stood firmly on all 4 legs, could run, could nudge for food with impatient little pushes of his head. But Cole had a habit no one could explain. Every morning, when Jolene stepped into the stable, he ran to her first, before she even had time to set her things down. The foal pressed his head against the arm with the burn scars, his muzzle resting against that pale, ridged skin from her wrist to her elbow. Every morning, without fail, as though he remembered that those hands had carried him out of the fire, as though beneath the scars there was a scent only he could recognize, the scent of the one who had saved him. That morning, Jolene sat on the grass in front of the new stable. Cole lay beside her, his head resting on her lap, his eyes half closed. Midnight stood just behind her, tall and calm, her neck lowered, her warm breath brushing gently through Jolene's hair. She sat between the 2 horses, her scarred arm resting across Cole's neck, her other hand idly turning a blade of grass. Around her wrist, the silver bracelet engraved with a horse caught the early sunlight. Beckett stepped out from the back door of the estate and walked down toward the stable. He stopped at the gate and looked inside. Jolene didn't see him. She was smiling because Cole had just lifted his head to nudge her shoulder for food, then settled it back into her lap as she stroked his muzzle. Midnight stood still, her breathing slow and steady against Jolene's hair, peaceful as though the night of fire had never happened. Harris stood beside Beckett and asked quietly, "Do you want me to call her in for a report on the horses?" Beckett didn't look at Harris. His eyes remained on the grass, on the girl sitting between the 2 black horses. "Let her be," he said. Harris was slightly surprised but didn't ask anything further. He nodded and stepped back. Beckett stood at the gate for a moment longer, then turned and walked back toward the house. Harris moved alongside him, beginning to recite the day's schedule, the meeting with partners, the numbers that needed to be handled. Beckett listened, nodded, slipping back into the rhythm of a man who controlled everything. His world hadn't changed. It was still power, still calculation, still decisions that ordinary people wouldn't dare consider. But when he reached the steps of the back entrance, Beckett stopped. He turned his head and looked down at the stable once more. From up there, he saw Jolene smiling, Cole nudging her for food, and Midnight standing beside her like a patient mother. Beckett Crane didn't smile. His face remained cold, still, the same face that the entire East Coast underworld feared. But he stood there for a few seconds longer than necessary, longer than a mafia boss should give to anyone. Then he went inside. Thank you for listening to this story. If it touched you in any way, please like and share so more people can hear it. How did this story make you feel? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We always want to hear what's in your heart. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, please subscribe so you don't miss the stories we bring every day. Wishing everyone watching this good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.